Everyone, welcome to another exciting, wonderful edition, a comics loving edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, I am delighted to be talking with author, creator, comics mastermind Benjamin Hunting. Benjamin, thank you for joining.
Thanks for taking the time to do this, Jason. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for sharing some of the book with me. It looks lovely and engaging. And the book is, as your title says, Model UN. The Model
That's right.
UN. Yeah. So interesting combination of concepts that are coming together for this book.
Yeah, I was originally thinking I was kind of on a hiatus from another project and I didn't want to have idle hands. And I'd had those two words, model UN, kind of kicking around in my head for a few weeks. And I didn't really know what to do with them. And I started to think, well, maybe kind of a slice of life series similar to Freaks and Geeks or something like that, where these
Hmm.
kids are their social hub is this model UN club that they're at in high school. But then I realized that pretty much any I was curious to start to try using a manga style format to tell the story because it seemed to fit the narrative well. I'd never done anything like that before. So I'm not a huge manga fan, and I'd done some research of some titles that I like, but I quickly came to realize that anything about high school that you want to say in manga has already been done by a Japanese master like 6 or 7 times beforehand, and I needed a hook. I needed something more than just a slice of life. So that's where I came up with the idea of, well, what if we shake the box up that these kids are in? It's always interesting to take your characters and put them under some kind of stress, especially if they're a bunch of different personalities. And that's when I had the idea of, well, what if aliens show up, and what if the reason they show up is because the leader of those aliens is such a doofus that they're convinced that these kids are the actual United Nations, and they won't be convinced of reality no matter what their crew tells them or what the kids tell them. And you end up with these two hierarchies, these kids in a private school in their model UN, which is meant to mimic the world's political structure, versus these aliens with their own hierarchy. And when they clash together, I think you get the chance to do some comedy from that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm a science fiction fan, and I'm also a comedy fan. And just from what I've seen of the book, I love that manga influence that's part of it. How did the collaborative team come together as far as connecting with an artist and the other people that have been involved?
So the artist that I'm working with as a co-creator on this project, i.e. Santiana Hernandez, we connected through a Facebook group that is designed to link artists with writers. And in my previous two projects, Code 45 and Dead Air, it was very different. It was Western style, full color, and I was working with an artist and a designer that I'd known for 25 years. In this case, connecting with someone over the internet that I'd never met in person and still haven't because he lives in Argentina, originally from Peru, and doing almost all of our interactions online in text form, which again is something different for me from a collaborative perspective. It was really interesting as a process. And what struck me the most one of the things I love the most about comics is how collaborative it is. You basically take two brains and then you mush them together, and hopefully you get the best parts of both of those brains on the page. Like that's the ideal thing, unless you're a writer and artist at the same time, in which case you only have one brain, probably at a disadvantage. But the cool thing was IE was really great about suggesting dynamics and movement and energy on the page. I would write something that would be fairly static, and he would come through with, well, I added some movement here. I added an extra panel, put in this kind of joke thing that I think is funny. And what do you think of that? And he would provide me with alternate takes on pages when we were in the layout stage and looking at pencils and whatnot. And that was new for me because previously that would be something I would have discussed beforehand and kind of talk through it. But in this case, I was actually able to see it to see how it would work. And in so many instances, it was an improvement over what I had seen in my brain. I mean, that's always how it is for writers with artists. I think you see things one way, they see things another way, and their way is better because they're masters of the visual medium. So it's been really great collaborating with him.
Yeah, cool, cool. Uh, I imagine a story like Model UN that features younger characters. Was there kind of a journey back for you? Did you kind of go back on your own path of growing up and coming of age?
So there's a yes and no to that. The no is I never got to be part of a Model UN club when I was younger, and I was
Mhm.
always jealous of people who did because it seemed super cool. And I can remember whenever it was portrayed in popular media, at least in the 90s when I was a teenager, coincidentally or not coincidentally, the same time period as this book, there would always be a point where it would culminate in a visit to New York City where they would check out United Nations headquarters, and it would be super interesting, and I would be envious of that. But in reality, I ended up I was expelled from public school up here in Quebec when I was 14 or 15 because I had a real smart mouth. And there are not a lot of English language schools in Quebec. It's mostly French speaking, especially in the small town I grew up in. So the only option I had was to attend this very small private school as a scholarship student for the remainder of my high school career. And that was not a great experience for me. I didn't fit in well with that type of structure. It was very like British boarding school style of things. I wasn't a boarder, but I was subject to the whims of those who were. And
Mhm.
when I was writing this book, I decided to take that experience and make something good out of it, to take the absurdity that I experienced, the things that I had gone through, and also, the cool kids that I met when I was there. It was a very international school, which was really eye opening for someone who grew up in small town Quebec at that point in my life. And just take all of that energy and put it on the page and try to transform it. So that's where the personal aspects of it come.
As far as the science fiction, what are some influences there? When did that kind of enter your life?
I mean, I've been a Star Trek fan since I can remember being conscious. The CBC up
Yeah.
here used to play the original series on syndication after school every day. I got into that, and then I got into the movies, and then eventually Next Generation and all that. But in terms of sci-fi that I think more directly connects with the work that I've done, a little bit less on this project, but on previous projects, people like Philip K. Dick, who was an
Mhm.
author whose work I voraciously devoured as a teenager, just especially entranced by the way he would question reality, consensus reality, shared reality. Is what I'm experiencing the same as the person who's sitting next to me? How could I ever know that? How could I ever be sure? Like, what do our senses tell us versus what reality actually is? So really fascinating explorations of that, and also identity would come up a lot in his work. And then on the visual side, a filmmaker, David Cronenberg, who's a Canadian
Mhm.
as well. I was exposed to his work much too young and had a lot of really weird experiences watching movies I didn't completely understand. But with Cronenberg, you got another question of identity and reality, but very body focused, using the body as a conduit to experiencing things that are perhaps outside of our existence. Movies like Videodrome and Crash are great. Even The Fly, great examples of that kind of storytelling and filmmaking, and that really seeped into my bones. And I've always been fascinated with those topics.
Yeah. Star Trek in its own way is kind of a model UN, isn't it? In terms of
It's
like, it's a United Nations on not wheels, but with a warp drive.
That's a good point. It's a utopian vision, right? Which is what I think the
Yeah.
United Nations would like to be,
Yep.
rather than
Yeah.
an arena for infighting, which I think is mostly what happens.
Right. Yeah, and that brings up another interesting point for this kind of book, which is you as the author get to have some fun with some satire, and you get
Yeah.
to sort of poke fun at some social conventions and political ideas and some of the ways that the world works. So I imagine that was also a great deal of fun.
Especially on the side of the aliens, because as you know, science fiction is all about describing humanity through a different lens. So when I brought the aliens into it, I was like, oh, I can really do an emperor has no clothes moment here and show what it's like to work with someone who's just consistently failed upwards and is a beneficiary of nepotism and really doesn't have the respect of their underlings, but yet there's no way around doing what that entity is ordering you to do. So that was, I mean, there's some social satire of the current political moment, but there's also just what it was like being in high school.
Right.
And especially the super weird high school I went to, which had things like prefects and like head of discipline and all that fun stuff that I think should, there's a lot of traditions I think that need to be ironed out of society, and this is a way for me to expose some of those to the air and the sunlight.
Yeah. What is your process like as you're writing? How does that come to be as you're kind of shaping characters? Is that something that stays pretty consistent? Is that something you sort of change as you go? You mentioned collaborating with the artistic part of the process too, so I'm just curious about that.
It's definitely, I think, with any collaborative project, a work in progress. As a
Mhm.
writer, well before I engage an artist in a project or approach someone, I pretty much have the story completed, or at least the structure of the story is done, and a good number of pages are already written. But once you start working with someone else, everything is up for grabs, in my opinion. If there's an idea that's going to make the story better, that's going to make it more interesting, if there's a better joke, I'm all for that. I mean, that's the entire idea, is to present an audience and a readership with the most entertaining thing you can, and the most meaningful thing that you can as well. Um, to that end, I worked with on this project, as on several other projects, an editor named Kevin Bircher, who's been a great foil for me in terms of calling me out on aspects of the story that I don't necessarily know aren't working. I'm a professional writer in my day job. I've been freelance for 17 years, mostly journalism and automotive and that kind of stuff. So I'm used to working with an editorial team, and it's always great when you have constructive criticism and people who are able to step outside of your perspective and give you their opinion on what you're doing in a much more objective fashion. And in this book in particular, there was an entire section of the book that I really loved. It was maybe 4 or 5 pages, and when I submitted the script to Kevin, he immediately came back with, well, I like the story until I got to this particular section, and it was the exact section that I've been so proud and happy with. And he's like, yeah, he's like, all the energy just kind of leaves the story, and we're treading water for these 4 pages. And you don't need any of this. It doesn't advance anything. And everything that you think you're doing here either doesn't need to happen or is already implied. And when I looked at it from his point of view, he was right. Like, I was just super into that. I really liked what I had written and I was excited about it, but it didn't help the story, and it's gone now. Just like cut it out. And I wouldn't have seen that on my own.
Yeah. Now, you might be the first person that I've talked with that's written in automotive as well as comics, which shows me you obviously have a love for the written word. How did you cultivate that?
That's a good question. I mean, I've had my nose buried in a book since I was like 5 years old. I was the kid who brought a book you know how people say these days, oh, everyone's on their phone. Well, I was always on my book. I always had, regardless of the situation, school, social events, walking around outside, I would have like a book and I would be reading it. And it was a problem. Like, I was not interacting with other people. I was just reading because reading was super interesting. And I think from that, I decided that I wanted to tell stories as well. And that was encouraged to a degree by my family and, some aspects of my schooling, just that I would do some competitions or some young authors conferences, which was a cool thing that we had up here in Canada when I was younger. And I enjoyed it, but no one ever presented it as a career. And I think that's a huge
Mhm.
mistake that a lot of, obviously the situation is quite different now. But in the 90s, when I was, coming of age, becoming an adult, whatnot, no one ever said, hey, your writing is great. Why don't you consider doing this professionally? Everyone was steering me towards, STEM. Like, it was just science, technology, engineering, medicine. That was the only way you would have value in an economy. And so I did that for a long time because I'd also been programming since I was like 7 or 8 years old. I had a Commodore VIC 20, and I remember saving programs to like an audio cassette drive because we couldn't afford a disk drive. And I actually dropped out of college to work at a .com in like '99, so it was
Uh-huh.
very much in the zeitgeist of the time. But I got burned out on it. Technology quickly became something. It transformed from something that was creative and interesting to a commodity,
Yep.
and I saw that happening
Yeah.
in the job market, and I decided I didn't want any part of that. It wasn't how I interfaced with tech. And I stayed on as a consultant for a while doing that kind of thing half-heartedly, but at night I decided to try freelancing. And I did freelancing part-time for about 6 months, and I've been working from home for a pharmaceuticals company on the tech side. And they got bought by a much bigger company, and I was told that I would have to start coming into the office, and I quit the next day and just went freelancing full time. And that was 17 years ago. I've not had a job in 17 years, not
Wow.
a full time, no full time employment. And I'd always had a passion for cars, but I was able to gradually over time build a client list that was skewing towards automotive. And then you start publishing enough in one area and you start attracting attention from other publications, and you can really build a client list. And it's been a really great niche for me. And it's something that I'm passionate about. And it's also a hobby. I'm racing cars and whatnot on my own. But what's nice is it like has nothing to do with my comics work, so I can disconnect from that. Like I have no interest in writing a comic about cars. Like it's not that's not why I'm doing this. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that might be
Yeah.
puzzling for some people to hear, but these are different outlets and different stories. So
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine stepping into comics, all of a sudden you have all these tools, all of this kind of work that you get to do with the comic script that just kind of sets you on a completely different path from writing technically.
yeah, it's so different. And the lucky thing for me, I got into comics late in life. I loved, Sunday in Canada it's Saturday morning, but in the US I know it's Sunday morning newspapers. Charles Schultz, Berkeley Breathe, GB Trudeau, Bill Watterson, Gary Larson. I loved all of that stuff when I was growing up. And then when I became a teenager, I still liked that, but I never made the transition to superheroes. It just didn't happen, and there's no reason for it. I think part of it was because growing up in a small town, and especially in Quebec, where your access to English language media and culture is fairly filtered and limited, there was no comic book store, so I didn't really have a place to go and find out what was going on. And I didn't know that independent comics existed, like at all, until
Mm,
my early 30s when I was living in Montreal. I moved to a new neighborhood, and a few blocks down the street there was a comic book store that had just opened up, Crossover Comics, and I stopped in and immediately got an education in all sorts of stories that I didn't know were out there. I think a big part of the reason why I create comics is visiting that shop and reading stuff by Alison Bechdel and Simon Hanselman and these
mm,
people who's they were telling stories that I was not hearing anywhere else, and that was amazing. And 8 or 9 years of hoovering all of that up, I decided I wanted to start doing that myself, and I lucked out because a very good friend of mine, her partner, who's also a friend, is a comic book artist, Joe Ing. Her name's Angela Hodge. She's a designer. But Joe has been an artist for Street Fighter, Transformers, a lot of Udon stuff for a
mm,
long time. And I started sketching out the idea for my first comic, Code 45, probably in like 2018, 2019. And I approached them and just asked, hey, do you know anyone who would be interested in making this real, making this into a comic for me? I want to hire an artist and get started on this. And surprisingly, Joe was interested. And so I spent the next 2 years making this book. But really, what happened was I spent 2 years at private comic book college with someone who had a ton of experience and who could guide me through all the things I needed to learn to be effective on the page as a storyteller. And there was so much I didn't know, and obviously so much I still don't know. I've only been making comics for like 6 or 7 years. It's a constant learning process. Every time I crack open a spine on someone else's work, I learn something new. And just
mm.
being at Joe's side like that and having him explain page turns and how to move the eye across the page and leaving space for dialogue and how many panels can I realistically put in, and like what all these things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a reader really gave me a great perspective that helped make me a better writer. And it's funny because if you read my first comic series, it's like 5 issue limited series. It gets better, like from issue 1 to issue 5. Like issue
Oh,
5 is
yeah.
a much more technically interesting and executed book, because I was able to suddenly, or not suddenly, but gradually play to the strengths of the artist that I was collaborating with and understand the common language that we had together. So that was a really cool process.
Nice, nice. Well, it does come through. The work looks wonderful and polished. As far as the
Santiana Hernandez
campaign,
makes me look good.
that's the collaborative team, right? That's the joy of it. Um, as far as the campaign, any details that you'd like to share about opening point, stopping point, anything along the way that listeners should know?
Sure. So it's live right now at modeluncomic.com, and it's the first part of a two-part story I'm doing. It's 54 pages, and I set myself the goal of telling everything in between 100 and 120 pages. I wanted to kind of put that limitation on myself as a way to spur creativity, because I find that limits can often force you to think of interesting ways to tell a story versus I didn't necessarily trust myself in a brand new style to just go on and on and on. So I planned it out to do 100, 120 pages. The starting point is this is the starting point, and the ending point will likely be available next spring. That's what I'm working towards. The book itself is complete now. The first half. As soon as the Kickstarter campaign's done and they do all their processing, I'm going to be sending it out. And this time, it's my first ever digital only campaign, which is super new for me. It's probably my sixth or seventh Kickstarter book. But given the tariff situation at the US border right now, there's no way I can ship physical books across the border with any kind of cost certainty. And the situation is fluid, it's changing on like a weekly basis. So the way comic book or any printing works is you kind of send your book to a printer and then you get it back eventually. Like it's not an exact science. And I didn't want anyone, primarily in the past my audience has been in the United States, and I didn't want anyone getting hit with a huge customs bill for a book just out of the blue. That really didn't seem fair. So this time it's digital only, and I'm offering the book a bundle with one of my past works, as well as another bundle that has several other indie creators who contributed to this campaign. But one of the more unique things that I'm trying with this particular Kickstarter is there is a tier where you can get Model UN and then the script for Model UN and then the layouts for Model UN. But in addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, Santiana Hernandez is really good about providing alternate versions of pages, and we would discuss those and decide how to move forward. So I'm providing those alternate versions of the pages and an explanation as to why it was the one that you see in the finished book was chosen, because sometimes you get two really great pages but you can't put them both in. So there's a decision making process between the artist and I when we figure out which one is going to work best. And that's kind of a peek behind the curtain of the creative process. And I think it's interesting to people, maybe if they're thinking about creating a comic book themselves, or maybe they just want to look behind the curtain and see what that's like.
Have we missed anything that you want to make sure to include before we tell people where to find out more in person and online and other such things?
I think the maybe the only thing left would be, people ask me to kind of describe the vibe of the comic. I took a lot of inspiration as well from late 90s, early 2000s teen movies, stuff like
Mhm.
Can't Hardly Wait and Bring It On, where you had,
Love
it's
that.
the last day of the year, there's a big party and you have all these different people from different social cliques in high school together in the same place. And in Bring It On, you have this cheerleading team where you have all these different people together in the same place, and you get personalities colliding, you get people discovering things about themselves that maybe they didn't know until they were put in a stressful situation, and you get people who thought that they had everything figured out discover that the world's a lot bigger than it seemed at the beginning of the day. And I wanted to take that kind of energy and put that into Model UN and add the sci-fi element, so that's something that was exciting for me.
Very cool. Those are films from my young adulthood too. So looking forward to seeing how all that plays out. If I'm a listener and I want to find out more, any online spaces, in-person spaces, or other such things that you want to mention?
Sure. You can find all of my writing, comic book and otherwise, at benjaminhunting.com. It's kind of the hub for everything I've been doing for the last really long time. Sometimes I find old posts and I shudder, but that's how it is. You grow up in public, right?
That's right. That's right.
The the In terms of social media, I'm kind of trying to stay off it these days because it's pretty negative, but you can find me on Instagram. I'm at Hunting Benjamin. People are generally not mean to me there or mean to anyone else. It's just photos and weird stuff that makes me laugh. So that's about as far as I'm going in terms of social media these days.
Don't blame you. I don't blame you at all. And you're certainly welcome back here anytime on this channel. Glad to share
I
about your
appreciate it.
work. And yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So glad to have connected with you.